everyone. I hope that intro was relaxing or interesting. Today's video is a gouache paint with me video, and I just wanted to talk about more of my experiences with using gouache paints and also create some type of atmospheric / relaxing / ASMR level type of video. I don't know, I'm trying to figure some stuff out here with my channel. With that being said, I am using Canson mixed media paper, a mechanical pencil with red lead, and the Himi Gouache 24 pack. And for those of you who weren't here, I revived these back in the summer, but they are still not up to par with how they came in the packaging. Which makes sense, I mean they are almost 5 years old, but since they're still workable paints, I have been working on using them regardless of their consistency and quality. I don't feel like it's necessary to upgrade to higher quality gouache paints unless I'm confident I enjoy using them, and of course this 24 pack came with so much pigment that it feels like a waste to just throw it away. And functionally I think they work perfectly fine for me because I'm not someone who would call themselves a gouache painter. I prefer oil paints, and so those paints matter a lot more, but watercolor and gouache, I'm fine with student grade or even beginner grade paints. Anyway, let me get into talking about this painting. I started off with that sketch underneath with that red lead. It's just 0.7 Pentel red lead. It's nothing special. And then I started using the burnt sienna Himi gouache color and building in some underpaintings. I really like working in layers, and last time I used gouache, I used it really thick, but this time I wanted to explore treating it like watercolor for the first part of the painting and then gouache for the second part, so I would get that thicker opaque effect. And I think I was pretty successful, if I do say so myself, but that meant starting off with very thin layers and trying not to use any thicker paint. And a large part of this is because this is the process I would personally use with oil painting, but also because gouache reactivates with water, and when you're constantly having your paint reactivate, it can often muddy the surface and create confusing colors or muddied colors. And quite frankly, nobody wants that. This also gave me more room to explore because I wasn't hard committing to any of my brush strokes or any of my colors. Gouache is very easy to remove with layers of water if you're careful with it, and also due to its opacity, it's very good for covering things up as well if need be, but the preference is still not to do that because again, you can get these thick layers that reactivate, and again, nobody wants that. And by this point, if you weren't already aware, I am painting Bella Swan from Twilight. Obviously one of my favorite comfort characters, so, sue me, I paint her a lot. But I found while doing this that I was able to record vertical footage and also horizontal footage, which was really good because I was able to make a short form video with this and also a long form video, and that was really motivating because that's something I've been wanting to do for a really long time. And it also got me excited about making YouTube videos again, which is good because I stopped for several months. And it was a lot more work to set up and actually record everything I was doing, but it was also a lot of fun, so I don't really consider it a downside or a negative at all. Yeah, but back to the painting. At this point, I was blocking in my darker colors because you can see I've already put in some of those skin tones and warm colors of the lips and cheeks and nose, but since the paper is white, it doesn't give you a very good view of how the colors would exist in a non-white surface, and so adding in the hair really helps me with addressing what skin tones should look like and how bright everything is. But I still didn't want to commit to too dark of darks, so it's still kind of a wash tone with some darker areas where the shadows are really, really obviously that dark, simply meaning that I would not need to worry about changing them in the future, or I would not need to be worrying about covering them up. This is really where I get to do the more fun parts of the painting, meaning the details, I get to start working on smaller areas and really tightening up everything I'm drawing. And I also had a lot of fun figuring out video angles and how to best record and what lighting would work really well. I had a lot of trouble with this previously when I was trying to make videos, so I'm glad to see that I've improved. But it was really nice to be able to paint and also have video recording and be able to understand my own thought process after seeing it on footage. I feel like that's not often thought about, the fact that we don't really understand every aspect of our own process until we see it in action because it's so innate to us, it's almost natural. As you can see, I spend a lot of time layering and spend a lot of time going very slowly. A lot of the artistic process in general is taking intentional actions very slowly in order to really think about what it is you're doing, whether you're completely aware of that or not. And this also changes with your relationship to the paints you're using. As you understand the material material more, you will also change your process to adjust to that. Like, one of the really great things about the Himi gouache is that it dries very quickly, which means I can layer very quickly. And because it's a thicker type of paint, it's not really embedding itself into the paper with water. Of course it can, but because these jelly gouaches are already wet, I don't have to add as much water to thin it out, and I don't have to worry as much about activating pigment because it's already a wet, movable paint. And there are instances where I do feel comfortable adding larger flashes of color, like the lips are very bold and bright, and it's because in my reference image and also in general, lips are often the first thing that we look to because their color is so naturally bright regardless of whose lips it is. And then the hair, which is very straightforward, brown in certain areas, very dark and very easy to paint in and color in, essentially, I was comfortable adding in. And then you can see the shadow on the left side of her face is darker because that was a very clear shadow that I felt comfortable blocking in without worrying too much about needing to change it later. I don't know, a lot of painting and a lot of layering techniques I use are based in oil painting, and with oil painting you use a lot of very thin layers of pigment to create the illusions of depth over time because everything is see-through. And that transparency helps to create different color tones on top of each other without actually using an excess amount of paint. And this was used classically because it used up less paint, which meant you could make your base of grisaille or black and white painting without using too much of your precious expensive paints, and then add color over it without necessarily using too much of, again, your very expensive pigment. But I think the same thing applies in modern day, even though these aren't necessarily the most expensive paints, just because you get a brighter, clearer look at skin, and it's very difficult to get that translucent nature of skin unless you use layers. I mean, there are a lot of people who paint just flat out by mixing all of the skin tones and adding them onto the canvas with a very flat brush and very thick strokes. But in my personal opinion, that technique is a little amateurish because you're not able to really understand the depth of the paint you're using. And this is no insult to people who do that. It's a perfectly fine technique. I just personally think it's a little bit flat looking when you're fully done with it because it doesn't really have the thickness of skin available to see. But eventually I was pretty satisfied with the buildup of color I had. I still wanted some level of transparency where you could see the paper and the white tones of the paper underneath the skin because I didn't really want to treat this entirely like opaque gouache. I was still going for that watercolor and gouache marriage even though I was just using the Himi gouache paints. And at the very end I added this blue toned background which was a lot greener and less saturated within my reference image, but I wanted to use something brighter that wasn't, difficult to mix. I find that the Himi gouache paints don't have good mixability because of their pigment quality, which is not necessarily very strong. And sometimes one paint you're trying to mix with another is extremely overbearing and you just don't get the color you're aiming to get. Essentially, everything I know about color theory does not work with these paints because the pigments are not as accurate as they appear to be on surface level. But for $25, you're bound to get paint with filler in it. It is an expectation I already had going into using these. Since I've used them a couple times within sketchbooks at this point, I am pretty satisfied with them, and I do understand why a lot of people adore them and use them for a lot of sketchbook work, especially for a replacement for watercolors. The Himi gouache is really good because it's more similar to acrylic in the sense that it doesn't tear up your paper or damage the integrity of your paper because it doesn't soak into the paper, rather just sits on top and layers on top of the paper itself. And this is a lot more forgiving than acrylic, which does seem to become very thick very quickly. And obviously it doesn't reactivate and it dries immediately, which is kind of a nightmare for me. So I'm actually really glad I spent the time reactivating these and making sure that they could work for me. And I will say some of the paints do seem to have the consistency of when you first open the packaging at this point, so keeping it wet and mixing it every so often does really help with maintaining your paints. And I feel like I had a lot of fun using them this painting and also the last one I made of my cat, so I will definitely be making more of these let's paint with me gouache type videos. Right now I'm in the space where I'm trying to transition from one social platform to another, and so I'm trying to figure out what works best for me on this new platform. So I just want to say thank you for sticking around, and I really hope you continue to stick around.